Hi and welcome to Power Play. I'm Mike Lecouteur in for Vashti Capellos. Tonight, 2 members of the U.S. National Guard shot near the White House. We're going to have a full report from the scene in just moments as this story continues to develop. Then, government help coming for certain sectors.
The Canadian steel and lumber industries will always be at the heart of Canada's competitiveness, our security, and our strength.
The Prime Minister announced a suite of support measures for a number of industries that just a few months ago, Carney said could see carve-outs from U.S. tariffs. We'll talk to industry leaders in just moments. Plus, 24 hours from Deal Day.
And I think there's a sense in Canada that we need to meet the moment together, but that needs to be done respectfully, in consultation.
I'm just not sure if he's going to be able to deliver, and they have a pretty divided caucus in cabinet right now, so we'll see what happens, but I really hope we get a pipeline out of it.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading to Calgary to announce an energy pact with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, or at least a memorandum of understanding. Our front bench will break down the politics behind that big reveal. Up today are Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. First, though,
2 of our brave members of the National Guard and the Department of War were brazenly attacked in a horrendous act of violence. They were shot. They're in critical condition. As you can see behind me, we have assembled the full force of both the federal and state and local law enforcement agencies to bring bear all of our resources to make sure we find the perpetrators responsible for this heinous act. And make no mistake, they will be brought to justice.
there you have the latest update from the scene with breaking news in Washington, D.C., where 2 members of the U.S. National Guard have been shot. That happened just near the White House, a few blocks away, actually. U.S. President Donald Trump is at his Florida residence at Mar-a-Lago, but he did comment on the shooting on his social media site, saying, quote, "The animal that shot the 2 National Guardsmen, with both being critically wounded and now in 2 separate hospitals, is also severely wounded. But regardless, will pay a very steep price." He went on to say, "God bless our great National Guard and all of our military and law enforcement. These are truly great people. I, as President of the United States, and everyone associated with the office of the presidency, am with you." End quote. We will continue to bring breaking developments on this throughout the show. Stay with us. In the meantime, though, back here in Ottawa, late today, Prime Minister Mark Carney laid out new supports for industries hit by U.S. tariffs, focusing specifically on steel and lumber.
So these new measures focus on 3 core objectives. First, to further limit foreign steel imports so as to increase domestic demand for Canadian steel producers. Second, to make it easier to buy and build with Canadian steel and lumber. And third, to invest in workers and businesses so they have the tools and the resources that they need to drive this industrial transformation.
With Canada-U.S. trade talks paused for the last month or so, Prime Minister Mark Carney laid out a suite of measures to support 2 sectors hardest hit by tariffs. Carney says 90% of our steel and lumber are exported to the U.S., and today's package includes the following: further limiting foreign steel imports from countries that we do not have a free trade agreement with, and they don't have that with Canada. It's going from 50% to 20% from those 2024 levels. Now, part of the support includes working with railway companies to cut interprovincial freight rates by 50% starting this coming spring. It would apply specifically to steel and lumber transport. There's also funding for worker training and sectoral loans to help companies adapt in this trade war. Joining me now are the leaders of 2 industries that have been hard hit by U.S. tariffs. Catherine Cobden is the president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, and Kurt Nickaday is the president of the BC Lumber Trade Council. Thank you both for being here. Catherine, I'll start with you on this one. How concerned are you that by making this announcement today, the government is signaling that a deal with the U.S. is nowhere close to being concluded, specifically in your sector?
I think what the government is signaling actually is that we can do more to help ourselves in a very uncertain and unpredictable environment. So, for some time, the steel industry was nervous of a deal that may be a bad deal or a deal that might be torn up. So we've really been supportive of the Prime Minister's vision to do what we can domestically and abroad, frankly, to stabilize our really important and strategic industries like steel and lumber.
Mr. Nickaday, do you feel the same way, or are you concerned that a deal that we had thought may have been possible, as Prime Minister Carney had said just a couple of months ago, is now even further out of reach?
Yeah, I think we do have some concerns about that. I think we certainly understand the complexities of the negotiations with the U.S., and we really appreciate the support measures, and that there's an urgent situation here. And so I think the federal government is really stepping up and doing measures that we are supportive of. But ultimately, the solution to this is to get a negotiated settlement with the U.S. So we do feel like that still needs to be the priority.
Mr. Nickaday, about a month ago, you said you felt like the lumber industry was, quote, a bit of an afterthought. Do you feel the same way after hearing that the support that was announced today? I guess what I'm asking is, was it fulsome enough, in your opinion?
I think it has. We'll have to look at the details, but it is quite comprehensive and really unprecedented. And so I do feel like we are a priority with the federal government. We want to make sure that we stay that way. We did have concerns that other sectors were getting more attention.
Ms. Cobden, the industry minister, Melanie Joly, said today in a teleconference from Japan that in the medium term, she wants to see our steel plants adapt and pivot to produce steel for our domestic needs. Can your producers even make it until then because of how precarious the situation is right now?
Well, that's why we were so relieved with the announcements made today that were pertaining to the steel sector, because they really will help us pivot in the moment. They will make immediate, impactful change to the domestic market situation, taking a direct run at unfair trade. So this is absolutely essential to help us survive for the pivot that Minister Joly was describing. Yes.
But Ms. Cobden, how quickly can you make that pivot, I guess, is my question, because we know how difficult times are right now for the steel industry in Canada. We also heard BC Construction Association CEO Chris Aitchison say that Canadian steel mills, I should say, don't make that full spectrum of construction grade products that the industry uses in the quantities that it needs right now. So how quickly can your members scale up?
Well, frankly, actually, to correct the record, we make 80% of what the country needs in volume, and we could replace 80% of imports today. So we're talking about a much smaller percentage than your question implies. So we really needed to support the current steel industry, the 80% of those things that we absolutely need as a country, and deal with unfair trade in our market. That's what the trade measures have done today. That's what the expansion to derivatives, downstream products will do for us today. And then that will give us the lifeline, frankly, to pivot our businesses to, doing more to recapture domestic market share for those products that we don't make yet. But frankly, our urgency was to protect the industry and the products that we are making today, which is substantial. That's 12 million tons of steel that we are hoping to protect with today's announcement.
What does it do to try and really help your industry, the steel industry, in that near term? Does this buy you the lifeline that you need?
Well, it's certainly going to help. We have been from day one, saying we need to do a major step, reevaluate, major step, reevaluate, and that's where we are. This is the second kind of step that the government has announced, and frankly, it has gone a long way towards what we were looking for. Will there be further steps needed? I would imagine there will be, and the reason for that is this is a very evolving situation. There is literally no certainty. Things change regularly, particularly in our relationship with the United States. More tariffs on steel goods are coming, for example, at the end of December. So we're I think we're going to have to just be ready for this is an evolving process, and we're going to need to keep pace.
Mr. Nickaday, it's interesting how Ms. Cobden talked about needing those major steps. In this announcement, there's a $500 million increase to the softwood lumber development program, and that provides, for viewers' sake, provides government-backed loans. In your mind, is it a problem that the money comes in the form of a loan instead of a subsidy?
No, I don't think so. I think liquidity is critical, and I think the issue has been with that program is making sure that it's rolled out in a timely manner, and because there is some urgency about companies getting access to that liquidity. We're also happy to see this increased supports for workers. There's been a lot of communities and workers have been suffering with this really challenging time. So it was encouraging to see some support for workers as well.
There's also a transportation element to this, and the way that the government will go and help to subsidize and to pay for some of the transport of steel and steel and lumber across the country. Mr. Nickaday, how much does that help your industry when you consider how much of it really is on the ends of the country?
Yeah, transportation is a major cost for the sector, and we've had some issues with transportation, the rail system in Canada, and the competitiveness of our system. So I think that was welcome news. I'll have to look at the details, but certainly it's a major cost, and it's been a concern, an ongoing concern, in terms of the competitiveness of our transportation system in Canada.
Ms. Cobden, do you think that will help in terms of different provinces using Canadian steel? Was that a big hurdle up until this point?
Well, certainly we're pivoting from a north-south relationship to an east-west right across the country. We do have steel plants, of course, in the west, but not all the way out to BC. So absolutely, to ensure the competitiveness of our industry, we need competitive rail rates. I think that anything that can help with that is going to be welcome news for the steel sector.
Mr. Nickaday,
we also haven't seen the details, so we're looking forward to seeing them.
Understood. And I know that this is very preliminary because that announcement just happened this afternoon. But Mr. Nickaday, is there something that you had been asking for that you feel is missing from this announcement today and really essential for your industry?
Well, I think, again, kind of at the end of the day, we are looking to get a softwood lumber agreement with the U.S., and that is something we'll continue to work with the federal government on, understand the complexities of that relationship with the U.S. But I think that still, for us, is the priority, and we're thankful for a lot of these supports that were announced today. I think they do really tick the box on a number of fronts. But that is our priority, is that negotiated settlement with the U.S., and that, I think, really is the solution for the longer term.
Ms. Cobden, in that vein, we heard the Prime Minister also say he's heading to D.C. for the FIFA World Cup draw, and that, yes, he will have a word. He didn't say to what extent with President Trump. What do you hope he communicates to the U.S. President with regards to both of your industries?
Yeah, look, I think that it's really important to understand that we have to do things to survive, but that in the long term, we want to have a North American approach to the steel industry, that we have a serious global challenge that we share in global overcapacity. And so ideally, we will align with the United States and Mexico to, combat unfair trade in North America. But for the moment, what today's announcement does, frankly, is gets us a lot of the way towards being able to demonstrate to the U.S. that we are as serious as they are. We will have effective outcomes against unfair trade with the steps that have been taken. And that gives me a lot of hope for, the ongoing, not the ongoing, but the negotiations to come.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Catherine Cobden is the President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, and Kirk Nickaday is the President of BC Lumber Trade Council. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned just a moment ago, the Prime Minister also confirmed he's heading to Washington next week, but trade talks may not be on the agenda just yet.
Next week is an important event for Canada because we are one of the co-hosts, as you know, of the World Cup, and we'll be participating alongside President Trump, other co-host, and the FIFA president. There'll be the selections of the countries for the various groups, Canada included, and I'll see the president around there. But again, I don't want to over-signal things.
We also learned that Prime Minister Carney spoke to President Trump yesterday. Now, he wasn't dismissive about questions about the conversation, but he also didn't share too many details.
I had a conversation, I went back and forth, but look, this is the kind of thing I didn't want to get drawn into, which is every little exchange. You know, there are substantive conversation, meetings and conversations and negotiations, and that's not what I'm alluding to be clear.
We're going to take you back to that breaking news in Washington, D.C. right now, where officials have just provided a briefing on the shooting of 2 National Guard members near the White House. CTV News Washington Bureau Chief Joy Malvin is on location for us right now. And Joy, the National Guard was deployed to D.C. as part of the U.S. President's push to safeguard the city. So what do we know about what happened here?
Well, the FBI Director Kash Patel just had a brief press conference, and he called this a targeted ambush. Apparently, the National Guard, they're outside of subway stations, the Metro. They're outside of the National Capitol on the corners. They've been here since August. And according to the FBI, a man walked up to the 2 National Guard. There were 3 of them actually standing there, walked up to the National Guard and opened fire. There was some confusion earlier on when the West Virginia governor said that the 2 National Guard who had been shot were dead. That is not true. He backtracked on that story. They are in critical condition, however, as is the suspect who is in custody. Now, the FBI also confirmed that there are no other suspects, but they do believe this was a targeted killing. You mentioned the National Guard being here since August, and they have not had a warm welcome here by some who say, look, we don't have a real problem with crime in this city. Sure, there are problems, but it's not, terrible here. And they... Secretary of War, as he calls himself, Pete Hegseth, is now saying he's going to deploy another 500 National Guard to this city.
Joy, just in closing, did the FBI director say anything about the suspect?
No, just that person was also severely injured. Apparently, there was some kind of scuffle. He wouldn't say whether or not someone shot at him because, of course, the National Guard here are armed. So he didn't say if someone shot at him or what exactly happened, but he is in hospital as well. Apparently, the man had no ID on him. So, again, the FBI believes that this was targeted, motivated, and pre-planned. And, of course, they will continue their investigation as these 2 National Guard fight for their lives tonight.
Okay, I appreciate the update. CTV News Washington Bureau Chief Joy Malvin on the scene in Washington, D.C., where 2 members of the National Guard have been shot at this hour. We'll keep tuned to CTV National News for her full report later on. Thanks for this, Joy. Time for a quick break. When we return, gauging how Canadians feel about the federal budget. CTV pollster Nick Nanos has the latest numbers. He's here as well. Those numbers since the Carney government presented its first budget. So how did it go over? I'm going to ask Nick right after this.
This government has the exclusive power. He has the exclusive legal authority. Will he match that authority with responsibility and approve a pipeline to the Pacific today?
He's leading on making Canadian steel, lumber, aluminum, and various commodities more available for homes, for big projects. That's what this Prime Minister is doing. He's leading.
We've gone from elbows up to who cares under this Prime Minister. Remember, he said he would negotiate a win and he would get a deal by July 21st.
Unlike the Leader of the Opposition, who would have signed any bad deal put in front of him,
that's right.
The Prime Minister didn't do that. We said we would do the work to support Canadian workers.
Pipelines and Canada-U.S. relations were the hot topics on Parliament Hill today. Prime Minister Carney wasn't in question period, but his announcement was all about responding to U.S. tariffs. So are those things the things that Canadians are most concerned about? Let's ask the founder and chief data scientist of Nanos Research. He's also our CTV pollster, Nick Nanos. Nick, welcome back. How you doing?
Good, Mike. How you doing?
So it seems to a lot of people in Ottawa that the budget kind of under-delivered, or at least was in some sense, underwhelming. How did it land outside of the political bubble?
Well, the thing is that we track every week, the issues and how people feel about the leaders and the ballot numbers. And, right now we see that the Liberals have about a 5-point advantage. It's like 42-37 in favor of the Liberals over the Conservatives. And to put that into context, Mike, 4 weeks ago, it was 39-37. So it was a statistical dead heat, a little bit of a bump for the Liberals coming up. The interesting thing is that the Conservative support, pretty rock solid, so no big change as a result of the budget. Liberals up a little bit, NDP down to 9%. And the thing is, that's bad for the Conservatives because the Conservatives need that progressive vote to split in order for them to pop up through the middle. So a little bit of movement between the Liberals and the New Democrats coming out of the budget.
As you mentioned, you measured preferred prime minister as well. We'll show some of those numbers. There's been successive polls now where we've seen Prime Minister Carney with a lead over Pierre Poilievre. In your opinion, at what point does that kind of opinion with Canadians become kind of cemented and almost immovable in terms of preferred prime minister?
Well, usually whoever the prime minister is happens to have an advantage because they are prime minister. In this particular case, this is a pretty big advantage for Mark Carney over Pierre Poilievre. It's about 27 percentage points or thereabouts. But, the kicker, Mike, is this. For the Liberal support, it's not about people liking the Liberals. It's not about people liking the last 10 years. It's really about Mark Carney. For the Conservative support, which has been steady since the election, right? Still exceptionally high. And in some cases, the thing is at 37%, Stephen Harper won 2 elections with about that level of support. But for the Conservatives, it's not about Pierre Poilievre. It's about people that want change. They don't like the Liberals, and they want to see things go in a different direction. So think of it this way. So we got one party, I think, for the Conservatives. I don't think those Conservative voters care who the leader is. They just want the Liberals out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Not to say that it could be anyone, but certainly it doesn't really matter as much to them. You've also got some new numbers that are coming out tomorrow about how Canadians are feeling about energy exports, and really timely because of what we could be having, what we expect to have tomorrow between Alberta and the federal government on the MOU. How are Canadians feeling about that now?
So in the new survey that we're just releasing with the University of Ottawa's Positive Energy Initiative, we asked Canadians about the destination for energy exports. What regions or countries should it go to? Right now, most of our exports go to the United States. But in this new survey, interestingly, 35% of Canadians wanted to see Europe as the top export destination for energy, followed by Asia at 24%. The U.S., third, Michael, at 19%. So what this speaks to is Canadians looking at future energy exports and not having the United States as a top priority, more likely to look to Europe or Asia for those oil and natural gas exports.
It's interesting because it's almost as if what Prime Minister Carney is trying to do is where opinion is following, or he's responding to that opinion that sentiment that maybe he knew was out there.
Yeah, I think it's probably a little bit of both. Because, the reality is the United States will always continue to be an important export destination for our energy. And but I think for a lot of Canadians, they just want to see a little diversification. And I think that's where, things like Asia as a market, places like Europe as a market for energy exports really comes into play. So I don't think it's anti-American. I think it's just more, let's diversify who our customers are for energy exports.
Yeah, last question for you. I can't help but think 11 months ago, and I want to take this sort of wide view of all of this now. 11 months ago, the numbers that you have presented and that you have given us today would have looked bizarre because there's no world in which we would have thought preferred prime minister would have been a Liberal and that the Liberals were ahead. What does that tell you about where this country has come in the last 11 months?
Well, it speaks to the disruption and the game changer that Donald Trump was. And you know what? When Donald Trump says Mark Carney owes him, he's kind of right, because he was a game changer. The Liberals under Justin Trudeau were really on a path to likely decimation. right? Yeah. And he was an unpopular prime minister. People wanted change. And Donald Trump basically changed the math in favor of someone looking at least Canadians looking at alternatives. And so Pierre Poilievre did well in the last election, but Mark Carney, as a person that can manage, or people perceived or thought had a better chance to manage that binational relationship, basically caught fire. But you know what, Michael? He still has to deliver, because talk is not enough, and people's patience as they worry about paying for the groceries and paying for housing will only last so long.
True. Prime Minister Carney called him a transformative prime minister, a transformative president. He's transformed a lot of your numbers. And, of course, we know that the prime minister can't exactly kick the ball around when he goes for the FIFA World Cup draw next week. Hopefully he does talk to President Trump. Nick Nanos, Chief Data Scientist and founder of Nanos Research. Appreciate you being here. Thanks for this.
Cheers.
Another quick, we got to take a quick break here. We're going to bring in our front bench. It's a big day tomorrow as we're going to preview the next political plays after Carney and Smith announce an Ottawa-Alberta energy agreement tomorrow. We got Sharon Carr, Sebastian Skamsky, Laura D'Angelo, and Jamie Ellerton. They're all standing by, and they'll be with us right after this.
I had a conversation. I went back and forth. But look, this is the kind of thing I didn't want to get drawn into, which is every little exchange. You know, there are substantive meetings and conversations and negotiations, and that's not what I'm alluding to be clear.
When you go to Washington next week, will you bring up with him the pain that our sectors are currently facing and talk about re-engaging?
I'll bring up with him what I bring up with him when I see him. These are points I do make to him. My exchange with the president yesterday was not newsworthy.
Well, as Canada rolls out more support for sectors hit hardest by Trump tariffs, does that mean that nothing new is coming on the Canada-U.S. file? Well, that's the $50 billion question. That number, by the way, is what Prime Minister Mark Carney says tariffs and the uncertainty from the trade war have cost the economy so far. Right now, talks are paused. But as you heard in that clip, the Prime Minister and President are still talking. Now, he didn't say who cares, but he did kind of say NBD, no big deal. But we do know that Carney will see Trump in D.C. next week at the draw for the FIFA World Cup. So let's dig into the politics of that meeting with our front bench. Happy to introduce everybody's favorite political couple in this country. Yes, they are so close together that we can't keep them far enough apart. Sharon Carr, CTV News political analyst. She's a former deputy chief of staff to the former finance minister Bill Morneau. I did not know a hug was coming. Next to her is Sebastian Skamsky. He was the former director of media relations to conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. I love the smiles. We don't see enough of that. Jamie Ellerton is principal at Canaptis, and he worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. Joining me in studio, Laura D'Angelo. She's with Enterprise Canada, and she previously worked in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office. Appreciate you all being here, despite Vashi not being here. We've talked about it during the commercial break, and I think we're all on a decent footing. And I'm going to try to start with Sharon, see whether or not I still have some of the Vashi magic here. How much of today's move do you think, Sharon, is an admission that the deal with the U.S. just isn't happening, and the fact that they had to do something for these two sectors?
I wouldn't say it's an admission. I think what we have to realize as a country is that we cannot rely on the U.S. to be a stable trading partner. So while these discussions and while actual North American free trade agreement is worked out in the coming months and year, we still have to do something for our sectors. And that's what we're seeing today. And that's what we saw Prime Minister Carney come out with. So I think what we need is immediate support for lumber and steel and a variety of other sectors that are getting impacted. And this was purely a way to address that. The conversations between Canada and U.S. will continue, but we have to stop relying on them, and this was a way to support the industries.
But Sebastian, I guess part of the question is, is this enough now? And does it give these industries enough time to pivot away from the U.S.? Because it feels to a lot of people, I think, like there won't be that deal anytime soon, and they've got to start to move on this now.
Well, I think that's one question. The other question, Mike, is how much does this bailout really give, how much time does this bailout give to Mark Carney? Mark Carney is really bailing himself out with this vast amount of money. We've seen do that in his budget as well, with really no regard for spending or the inflation it will cause. But I think we need to hold Prime Minister Carney to account by his own metrics. He was the one who imposed a deadline on himself of July 21st, later to the beginning of August. And it is the end of November. It's almost Christmas, and nothing has moved. So while Prime Minister Carney may say that he doesn't care, obviously workers in the steel industry and the lumber industry, where, by the way, under Prime Minister Carney, the tariffs on Canadian lumber have tripled. He needs to buy himself time, and he's doing that with taxpayer money with this subsidy.
Laura, do you think that Carney is bailing himself out, and will this buy him a bit more time while he continues to try and get those talks restarted?
I don't think the Prime Minister is trying to bail himself out. I think, to Sharon's point, the Prime Minister can't just sit around and wait for Trump to change his mind based on whatever he's hearing. And so the Prime Minister is doing a few things here, right? These sectoral supports are to protect our industries, protect jobs, and he does have to do that, right? If he doesn't do that, we're looking at mills closing down, for example, in BC over the winter. It has to happen. But he's also trying to grow our economy in various ways, and we're seeing that in a couple of ways. He was just in the Middle East signing different trade deals, right? Like, he is growing our economy, diversifying our trading partners, while also to spur the domestic economy. He's using all of the tools in the toolkit. And so I don't think it's quite as, politically, as much of a political tool as Seb is trying to outline here. I think he is truly trying to do what is best for Canadians and for Canada's economy.
Jamie, how much of that is being properly explained to Canadians in your mind? I mean, what both Sharon and Laura are sort of sketching out is really trying to wean ourselves off of the United States as much as possible, because I don't think there's anybody on this panel that would disagree how heavily dependent Canada was on the U.S. But do you think that he's communicating that in a way that, Canadians can, A, get behind, and B, that people understand that it's not going to happen overnight either?
Yeah, I think there's a few things happening here, Mike. I think if you are working or somehow related to the steel industry, today's message is going to land with you. When you see economic hardship and economic shocks in this country, it's quite now become commonplace to see government support workers as a bridge to get them to more stability, whether that was the global financial crisis in 2008, obviously the world shutting down with COVID, and now the result of U.S. instability and the tariffs and kind of what that's doing for our economy. So if you're impacted by steel and lumber, you're hearing this, the fact that you get to continue to go to work while the Prime Minister is essentially providing financing to give these companies a bridge to whatever a new normal is going to be, I think they're going to hear this message. When you think of Canadians writ large who don't have direct exposure to lumber and steel, I think the broader debate continues to become what is Canada's future, who's best to deal with Donald Trump, and how do we kind of realize what Sharon's talking about in terms of creating a new economic normal for Canada. And I think how that lands and that debate is very much still up for grabs.
Yeah, Sharon, why is it up for grabs? Why do you think that this Prime Minister maybe has not done a good enough job, in some people's opinions, of trying to communicate that?
Well, I would say it's not something that's super easy to communicate to Canadians as a whole. A lot of folks don't necessarily understand the nuance of what a trade war can do to day-to-day lives as well, and what that means for industry. So I think what the government and the Prime Minister and ministers have to do is a bit of a better job at communicating how these types of reliefs will potentially kind of have a downward effect on everybody in terms of helping them. So it is a communications issue, but also at the same time, we live in a political world and it's political rhetoric. I think most industry, we saw two individuals, both from steel and lumber associations that were on the show just before this, who were for the most part welcoming today's announcement in terms of what it means for their industry. So I think for the most part, if you talk to the business community, if you talk to the sector, they welcome this. But again, people still are concerned about what does this mean for Canada, U.S., and for future trade negotiations.
Yeah, and Sebastian, I think, that is kind of the opening that Pierre Poilievre continues to drive through, right? And to sort of say, okay, what does this mean for, the person who lives on to say Main Street in, any town, Canada? Is that where he's going to continue to go if the Liberals have not made that explanation yet as to how it does sort of affect everyday Canadians?
Well, listen, Mike, I don't know that communication really is the struggle here for the average Canadian. Frankly, hot air from the Prime Minister or his ministers doesn't put food on the table or a roof over their heads. The challenge is, I think, quite simple, where Mr. Carney had declared to Canadians that he would be the only one that could solve this crisis with President Trump. That is what he sold Canadians. He didn't tell Canadians that we're going to subsidize our way out of this and overtax for the future generation just to get by right now. This is unsustainable. I think Mr. Poilievre has pointed that out today. And on top of it, it is not what Prime Minister Carney sold himself as. So I think Mr. Poilievre is going to continue to hammer on that. He's going to make the point that Canadians have been sold a bill of goods, and it's not really coming to fruition.
Yeah, okay. We're going to take a quick commercial break because maybe, to the point that the panel's making, maybe, trying to sell tariffs isn't that sort of sexy object that governments try and do. It can be difficult to talk about how it does actually get down to everyday Canadians. But hey, this panel does a great job of it, right? We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we bring the panel back, we're going to preview tomorrow's long-awaited federal Alberta deal announcement, that memorandum of understanding. We're going to take it apart right after this.
David Eby, the Premier of BC, has absolutely no constitutional authority to block a pipeline. Will the Prime Minister stop hiding behind the powerless Premier, get out of the way, and approve a pipeline to the Pacific today?
I'd invite the member opposite to buy a ticket to Calgary tomorrow to see how a federal government works with the provincial government to build Canada strong.
Tomorrow, the Prime Minister will wave around in the air a worthless piece of paper that he says that the Premier of BC can veto any time he wants.
Maybe the member opposite should explain to his constituents why the Premier of Alberta wants to stand beside our Prime Minister and talk about how to build Canada strong.
We're set to get that long-awaited memorandum of understanding on energy between Alberta and Ottawa tomorrow. Now, it's the federal government's first step in response to Alberta's push to get a new bitumen pipeline built to BC's northwestern coast. So we know that it makes Alberta Premier Danielle Smith pretty happy, but one province west, BC's David Eby, remains staunchly opposed. Back to dig into the political play, here is their front bench: Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. Laura, one of the things that I think I want to start with here, as well as the sort of the inter-caucus dynamic, because of the number of Liberal BC MPs who are in a position here. How is that playing out?
This is a big challenge for the Prime Minister, right? We actually can't deny that. We can't talk about this MOU and a pipeline without talking about the fact that the Prime Minister has a political challenge. He has a number of BC MPs, a number of Quebec MPs who historically have been very opposed to this pipeline and who are also trying to balance the same thing he is, which is, frankly, a pretty progressive base, pretty progressive voter base, with the need to strengthen our economy, the need to show each province that their economies matter to the Prime Minister and to the country. But what's also clear to me when I watch this is that, and watching the budget, the Prime Minister is a betting man. Mm-hmm. And he has decided to bet on a pipeline. He's decided to deliberately walk one of the most difficult paths for a Liberal Prime Minister to walk, talking about pipeline politics and putting some money on that, while also attempting to strengthen some environmental policy with what it looks like the caveats are going to be.
Yeah, and Jamie, at the same time, he continues to almost downplay what we're expected to see in the MOU. I mean, he continues to say, look, this is not the deal, this is the pathway to it. And he continues to use this language around it, almost, not to say undercutting what we're all expecting tomorrow, but certainly tempering those expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, Mike. And I think part of the challenge of what you're seeing here is actually looking at just how rancorous and divisive pipeline debates have been in Canada over the past 15 years. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity for the Prime Minister, working with United Conservative Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta to rewrite this script and rehab this debate and get more Canadians on side that we saw in the past, not only for national unity, which is ultimately what it came down to when the Trudeau government intervened to nationalize and follow through on the expansion of what was then the Kinder Morgan project, but to actually get the economy growing in this country in the face of what we see south of the border. And so it's going to sound, I think, a lot more government speak than it will be engineers talking about where pipelines are going to be and how it's going to be fitted. But I think part of the debate that needs to play out here over the coming weeks and months to actually get this thing built is to actually educate the public on the state of modern engineering, how tanker traffic actually works, and all the safety precautions that are in place so that oil spills don't happen, and the kind of like worst of ducts covered with oil like you saw in movies in the 90s is just frankly not a reality today because of modern engineering, and the men and women who work in the industry are able to do it. And I think you're going to see that debate take out, and I think part of what you're going to have to see for that to be successful is to have less of the name calling that you saw in the past, where radical this and radical that, and kind of like two people never talking to each other, and actually work on convincing skeptics. The ardent opponents who are going to be radically opposed to this, they're not ultimately the audience because you know they're going to be against it no matter what. They've shown themselves to be against all development in this country for a very long time. But for people who are skeptical and for people who also have concerns about climate, especially in that Liberal voting coalition, to speak to them directly to say, here's how we're mitigating the climate piece, here's how we're actually going to be able to this built, and here's all the environmental protections that are in place thanks to the ingenuity of technology and Canadian men and women working in the industry. That is, I think, the message the Prime Minister is going to sell. The fact that he has Premier Smith potentially making that with him, I think makes it far better for Canada that this pipeline gets built. And so, yes, I think, you're going to see this paper process. It's an MOU. We'll see what other buzz clips come out of it in terms of the term. But I think this is ultimately laying the foundation to actually resolve the impasse we've seen in pipeline politics in this country for 15 years.
How important is that, Sharon, then tomorrow in the language that the Prime Minister uses and to Jamie's point, really kind of explaining it as much as possible, to Laura's point as well, to make sure that he's not only speaking to Canadians about it, but also to people within his own caucus about how he can walk and chew gum at the same time?
It's going to be extremely important. Listen, like everyone has said, pipeline politics in this country has been one of the most divisive conversations to be had. I can speak from both perspectives of having worked in government when we acquired TMX and the type of rhetoric that came out of both sides during the discussions and the negotiations. And prior to that, having worked for TC Energy when we tried to build Keystone and Energy East and crisscrossing this country and trying to understand what makes people tick when it comes to pipeline politics, the language the Prime Minister uses is going to be vital. But what I can say, and I can't emphasize this enough, I know people are going to say an MOU is nothing, but it is the foundation to something that is extremely important, I would say even beyond pipelines, which is national unity. The West has felt extremely alienated, and in some cases, rightfully. The dialogue has been pretty divisive, and there's been cabinet ministers who have used tone and tenor to kind of express their views on that. And I think this is a really pivotal moment where we do not see Danielle Smith speaking out against Carney. And I think tomorrow we're going to see them pretty hand in hand in looking at what the future of pipelines in Canada can look like. And you know what, Premier Eby is going to have a bit of a rude awakening on his front too, because I do think he is missing some of the political calculus here.
Sebastian, what does this do to Conservatives here in Ottawa who have often gone to that card and sort of played that card of saying, well, Liberals aren't building a pipeline, they'll never build a pipeline, they'll never be behind it. If indeed we see that sort of pathway in the MOU, what does that do to Pierre Poilievre's argument over whether or not Mark Carney can get big things done and big things built in this country?
Well, Mike, forgive me for not sharing the enthusiasm for this theater production that the panel has and that the Liberal-friendly media has been feeding to Canadians and especially Carney's boomer base. Here's the reality of what's happening tomorrow. Prime Minister Carney is going to put on a fantastic and wonderful show. He's going to, once again, sign a piece of paper that is otherwise, by his own assertion, rather meaningless. Just yesterday, Prime Minister Carney said that this MOU will create the necessary but not sufficient conditions for a pipeline. So what is the whole point of going through this process? I think it's, once again, Prime Minister Carney putting on an incredible show for Canadians on every side of the spectrum to reveal himself to be something that he is not, which is somebody who can actually get things built and get our resources to market. As long as Conservatives continue to point this out, and as long as Prime Minister Carney prevents himself from building a pipeline, which under the British North America Act, I know this is kind of boring, Section 92 permits him to build this, even despite Premier Eby's objections. Until he actually does that, I think Conservatives are in solid shape and will continue to point out this hypocrisy.
But Sebastian, even if he's standing beside a smiling Daniel Smith?
Well, I hope Premier Smith is smiling. I would be smiling too if I was beaten over a bat by the previous Liberal administration for a decade, and now someone is putting out a gentle peace offering. It would be absurd for her to say no and spit in the face of that. But again, why doesn't Prime Minister Carney set out a date for when this pipeline will be built? He's been asked that, and just yesterday, again, he said that really downplayed his own plans and ambitions for this MOU.
All right, last word to you, Laura.
I do think that we're missing a key part of this, which is they need a proponent, right? Like they do need a private sector proponent or proponents at some point. And so
because right now Alberta's the proponent.
Correct. Right now Alberta's the proponent, but this is a really important step. And I think just focusing on it's just a piece of paper misses a really key part of what Jamie was saying, which is we do need to neutralize pipeline politics in the country. We have to be able to have a conversation about the natural resources we have available to us, responsible ways of getting those to market, and growing the economy nationwide, while we're also giving a chance to every province to have their sector propped up. And we're seeing some of that with, for example, the huge amount of projects in BC on the MPO list. So I do think the Prime Minister is actually setting us up for a pretty powerful portfolio that private investors can look at and feel like there's going to be some support here.
Yeah, and we'll see whether or not it's a lunch bag letdown tomorrow, as Sebastian maybe is thinking, or we'll see how it goes either way. Okay, thanks to the front bench, Laura D'Angelo, Sebastian Skamsky, Sharon Carr, and Jamie Ellerton. Stay with us. Power Play. We'll be right back after this. Just before we say goodbye, we have a programming note for you. Tomorrow, we have a special edition of Power Play to bring you. Vashti Kapelos will be here at 11:30 Eastern Time for special coverage of the signing of that Memorandum of Understanding between Alberta and Ottawa on energy. You can catch it on CTV News Channel and ctvnews.ca. That does it for us today. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Stay tuned, though, to CTV News Channel for the latest on that shooting in Washington, D.C. Good night.